Welcome to the Stories of School Leadership podcast, the podcast where we elevate the voices of and create connections between inspirational leaders from the UK and around the world. I'm Emma Lurie, and thank you for joining me as I share these journeys, inspirations, and stories of education, leadership, and life. In this episode, I'm joined by Nancy Lhoest-Squicciarini, all the way from Luxembourg, and her passion is in middle leadership. So we talk about middle leaders and how important it is that we support them, the sort of structures that are in place to support middle leaders and elevate their voices and help them to thrive. And she's an expert facilitator. She has some really fascinating and practical tips that we can think about when we're running staff meetings or training, ideas that we can definitely get going with. So I really hope you enjoy this one with Nancy. Let's get going. Hi, Nancy. It's so brilliant to have you spend a little bit of time with me. So tell us, who are you and where are you in the world?
First of all, thank you, Emma, for having me here. I am thrilled. So to everybody, my name is Nancy Lhoest-Squicciarini, and currently I live in Luxembourg, which is a very small and beautiful country that is surrounded by Belgium, France, and Germany. For 31 years, I worked at the International School of Luxembourg, and I loved it. I loved the school, everything about it. When I first arrived at the school, there were 211 students. And when I left, there were about 1,300 students. So I really saw the transition, and I just adored the people, the staff. There was such a beautiful culture there. Prior to that, I worked in New York. I worked in the New York public school districts. And now I work for the Educational Collaborative for International Schools, also known as ECIS. And I am head, and very proud to be head of the Middle Leader Certificate Program.
Amazing. We're going to have to track back and figure out how it all happened. But
I love it.
Yeah, it sounds like a really fascinating career. And I've never been to Luxembourg, but I think now
I will. It's beautiful.
So, well, tell me about your own kind of childhood experience. What was your own schooling like? Where did you go to school?
Well, actually, I was born, I know you couldn't really tell by the accent, but I am from New York. When it's so funny, when I'm in New York, my brothers and sisters say I lost my accent.
Yeah.
Because most of my family sound like Rocky Balboa or like Robert De Niro. Like, what? Who are you talking about? What are you talking about? And I come in and they think I have no accent. So when I come to Europe, they're like, "Oh, you're from New York." I'm like, "Really?" Because when I go to New York, everyone says I have no accent. So I grew up as a child in Brooklyn, New York, and I actually went to a parochial school, a Catholic school, and then we moved out to a part of New York called Long Island, and I just went to a regular public high school, which I loved. What was biggest, I would say, shock when I came to Europe was my graduating class was almost 900 students from high school, and there were two high schools, and each class about 900. And then when I moved to Europe, when I first arrived in Luxembourg, the international, I think the graduating class was 11.
So a bit different.
It was a big transition going from this, public school district to suddenly going to Europe. And then I did my studies in New York. I went to a Cortland State University. I love that school. It's a state university in New York. And then I started working on my graduate studies at a school that was referred to as CW Post University, which I think it's been renamed because it was like 35 years ago. I don't remember. And that was where I did my main studies. And then when I came to Europe, I started doing other degrees, not degrees, but I would say trainings. For example, there's the Principals Training Center, and I got my certificate of international leadership from that organization. It's a great organization. You have courses that go on for 7 days. Imagine 7 days from 8:30 to 3:30. And then you get a break, and then you have another 2. But you build such connections. I mean, people that I met back in 2009, I'm still friends with today. So I love that type of learning, that type of connection. And then I continue to learn. I think for me, I love reading, being on social media, the positive side of social media. And that's why I keep my learning continuing from what other resources I can gather and gain as well.
Amazing. So did you always want to teach and be in the education sector? Was it a thing?
I have to admit, I'm one of those geeks, and I'm going to say, yes, I just loved school. Even when I had like a nun as a teacher, like, so when I went to Catholic school, they were 50 in a classroom, and you sat in rows. So it wasn't like, oh, let's make circles, let's have stations. No, your desks were nailed to a floor and you sat in rows. Like, people laugh. I'm like, that was my elementary school. But I loved the teachers. There was something about the the engagement. And then when I went to a public school, I loved it even more because, first of all, I was out of a uniform. Nothing against uniforms, and everybody come after you after this podcast saying Nancy said something about uniforms. But I felt different being able to wear, and I just always connected with school. I found it a second home. There were so many areas that I could just engage in. I loved sports, so I had sports. I loved doing. I was the geek, like I was the jock. I used to have very long hair, like I used to be able to sit on it, and I cut it this short when I was 18. So, but when I was in high school, I used to wear it in this thick ponytail because I played sport all the time. And I was just that jock girl. It was just sport, sport, sport. During my lunch, you're going to laugh, I used to run around the track so I can get a 2-mile run in.
Yeah. How healthy of you.
And I was a geek, but I had friends. So it wasn't like...
It sounds like best of everything.
It was
and
great.
It's nice to hear a lot of people that I've spoken to have said they didn't really enjoy school, or they felt like they didn't fit. So it's nice to hear when people just genuinely loved it and had a really great time there.
Oh, I still keep in touch with my 6th grade teacher.
Oh,
She taught me how to do needlepoint. She loved to needle, and she was the most amazing woman. And she was just something about her that I just loved her energy. And even today, I think she's approximately 85. Whenever I'm in New York, we have to have lunch.
Oh,
I just love her. And even when I started teaching, she was my mentor. And I would just call her and be like, this is happening. She's like, make sure you handle it, you document. And she's someone that I had her when I'm going to be 60 in like 3 months. So I met her when I was 11, and I still have a relationship with my 6th grade teacher. I love her.
Amazing.
Yeah, I was very fortunate that way. Very fortunate.
Oh, that's so lovely. It's so nice when and I guess for her that must be so amazing to have seen your like journey and everything you've done, and that she's such an inspiration to you.
She is. She's a lovely lady, just incredible, such a heart, and very cool too. She was a real New Yorker. She was a real New Yorker, and the way she dressed, I just loved everything about her. She was very kind-hearted, and she took time for not just me, many people, everyone just loved her. Yeah. She was just a very good person.
Oh, the difference that we can make. So did you teach for a bit near New York? I can't speak, near New York.
I did. I taught in New York. I taught 3rd grade and then 5th grade. And then I coached volleyball at the high school. I love volleyball. I coached forever. It was the sport that I loved. I loved field hockey, but volleyball was my big love. And then the reason why I came to Europe, and most people say they come to international education because they want the experience, they want the adventure, they want to travel. That was not on my list as well. I was playing volleyball at a league, and a gentleman came by, and who was the owner of the league, and said, listen, we have this guy and he wants to play volleyball. And I was like, but it was an expensive league, you had to pay. So no one wanted him because he was really tiny. And I thought, oh, that's so not like, I thought that's so unkind. There's this guy standing, and he's from Europe, and he just wants to play, and no one's taking him. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have this guilt on me. So I said, let me invite him to play on the team. And then I said, I can cover his money, don't worry, because he's traveling. He's going to be in 6 months in the country. I will, So his English was okay, and he kept on saying, I'm a passer. Passer is a setter. And I said, listen, buddy, I'm the only setter. There's 6 guys. And I just thought, you just play. And then I threw him I was like the team captain. I put him on court, and I said, okay, I'm going to give you a ball, and let's see if he can do anything, because he wasn't that big. Oh my goodness. He has a vertical jump like 2 meters. He was like on the Belgian national team. And I'm like, I love you. Like, you're amazing. So we started playing volleyball. Very long story short, I followed him to Europe. And that's how I got into international education. So yes, it was for the adventure, but I actually just found my husband, who I've been married to 30 years now. So
Oh, I love that. What, there's no better reason to go to Europe
no
than
better.
falling in love.
It's falling in love. And now I've had the adventure of travel and meeting people, but it was actually such a blessing. I just can't believe when I tell people we met on a volleyball court. That's exactly that's where it happened, where it started.
Meant to be, I guess.
Yes.
So when you got to Luxembourg, what were your kind of roles then? What sort of things were you doing then in education?
At that point, my first year, which was very difficult because I only taught third grade for 1 year. I'm really more of a middle school, but the only opening was third grade. So I did third grade for my first year, but then the principal realized I'm not really a third grade teacher. So I moved into a sixth grade integrated program, and I loved it. And then I became the sixth grade coordinator. Of course, still coaching volleyball. Once I left New York, I had to keep on coaching volleyball. And then I continued with sixth grade. And then about 10 years later, I was at the International School of Luxembourg, as I mentioned, 31 years. So the first 10 years I was in the lower school. And then they decided to have a middle school, and sixth grade became part of the middle school. So then middle school was under the umbrella of upper school. And then I taught sixth grade for almost, I want to say 19 years at that school. I mean, everyone just knew Miss S. It was like, oh, you have Miss S. You have Miss S. And I then became, which I really give credit to my principal, because I became department head for Group 1 IB. And all the other department heads for the IB groups were a high school teacher. And I never taught IB. I never taught
the International Baccalaureate?
Exactly. Yeah. And here I am now leading a group, but I never taught it. But she knew I loved facilitation. I loved the idea of collaboration and effective collaboration. And she said the teachers knew their craft. They were excellent IB teachers. The challenge with the group was ensuring that they had conversations that were focused on student learning, and they were time effective, and they were meeting certain goals. So to my principal, a big shout out to Nikki Crush, she then appointed me a sixth grade teacher who was chair, department head of Group 1 IB. And it worked out beautifully because I had teachers, like a really experienced IB teacher, Clark Thayer. I would sit with him. I'm like, tell me about the IA. I need to learn about the IA. I went to the IB workshop, but I needed this guy. He taught for like 30 years. I said, teach me, show me. So he'd be like, okay, here's an IA. Read it. I want you to grade it. And then I'll tell you what I would grade. So here I am learning from a master teacher. And here I am, the chair of the department chair, but yet the learning was continuous. You know, it was really a reciprocal feeling because everyone knew I had a skill set. It wasn't knowing how to, I knew the IB, but not to that degree. Yeah. And it was lovely to have that type of relationship of going back and forth and watching, you know, can I sit with you while you're doing the orals? You know, and it was a wonderful experience. I loved it. Loved it.
And I guess for them, for you going in though, being so open about not having that knowledge is really important. I think sometimes leaders don't always do that, and we feel as leaders like we need to know everything and be able to do all of it, whereas actually no, what you need to do is be able to facilitate discussions and recognize the strengths of others. So it's having that knowledge, isn't it, and not worrying. I think, you know, maybe lots of people wouldn't put themselves in those positions because they'd say, well, I don't know enough about it. And lots of people often say, yeah, I needed another leader to go, come on, you can do it, you have the skill set that you need to do this little bit.
I totally agree. It's the facilitating of discussions, because I remember that summer I went to an IB conference, category 1. I studied it. So I knew everything about the questions. I knew the book list, but I needed to see the application. And they were so kind. You know, everyone knew. And you said it beautifully, Emma. It was knowing that they knew I knew how to facilitate a meeting. And I knew their expertise was vast. I think between 4 teachers, there could have been almost, I would say, 70 years of experience. But they also knew we needed greater focus and intentionality of how are we using our time? How are we following up? And that was the beauty of it. So I have to admit, the 5 years that I did it, I loved it. I learned so much from, and they learned from me. They were like, oh, we never thought you could have an agenda. We should have, you know, a conclusion to a meeting. I'm like, yes. So it was a nice give and take, a beautiful reciprocal learning situation.
Amazing. And so what else what happened next? I know you kind of have passion now, kind of middle leaders, and what was your next step in your leadership?
Then I applied and I became assistant principal, responsible for teaching and learning and professional development. And I loved it because now I was in the upper school working with all the heads of department. So I went from a head of department to assistant principal. And it was still the same approach because I never taught IB physics and I was still joining group 4 and group 5 saying, okay, you guys are doing the IA, let me do it, and I love that. And what was really powerful when I appreciate it, again, working with Nikki Crush, my passion was collaborative learning and elevating the idea of expertise, that collective wisdom you get in a group. So we started doing peer visits, celebrating each other in our teaching. We started every meeting with a teacher sharing best practice. So it wasn't about me. My job was almost, I'm in the back. How do I lift these others to start every meeting? And then all of a sudden we started getting norms. Like every meeting starts, we now have norms of how we collaborate. We have norms of when we walk and do walkthroughs. And when you see that starting to get embedded in a culture, you don't get a bigger, satisfaction. You're like, oh, and it wasn't about an individual. It was about this collective, really approach that people saw the impact that it was having on conversations and eventually student learning. And you couldn't get a better job. Loved it.
And that's a legacy, isn't it, that you can leave? Like, I think take away the kind of hero leadership, I'm going to do it all, like we just said, and build in systems that people can do for themselves, that you're giving them those strategies that are working, then they can run it when you're not there, which is if you're that kind of leader where you recognize the value of that facilitation, then that's so exciting, and you're like, oh, they can do it by themselves. I can
it's so
go
great.
off and do something else now.
Or when you watch someone facilitate a meeting that you've been training and you're like, my work is done, you just take a step back and you're like, oh, this is beautiful. They had their inclusion activities, they had their closure, they had their goals, you just think that. And what the most important thing is, the team felt that, most meetings for teams are after school. Everyone's exhausted. Nobody wakes up on the Wednesday as a teacher and says, oh my goodness, you know what today is? Today's a meeting after school. I'm thrilled. I can't wait. No one thinks like that. But at least when they leave, they can say, we had an objective, we met the objective, and most importantly, we had a little bit of fun as well. I always believe that you have to smile, you have to have a laugh together. So mixing the two of have intentionality with objectives, but also enjoying each other as colleagues. I think that's essential also when you're looking at the time and place of those type of meetings.
Yeah, and that comes up a lot. Before we started recording, I kind of mentioned some of the challenges that we're facing here in the UK. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is just how sometimes that joy and that fun can get lost because we're on this treadmill of like, we've got to go, 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 go. And I think, that's such an important thing to bring in, isn't it?
It is, because it's the human capital. You can actually have more productive and efficient work completed if you understand the human capital of your staff. And that human capital that you have to learn through, like I said, the idea of inclusion activities, elevating their expertise, elevating their experiences. And once you know that, it's the idea of the difference between distributive leadership and delegated. Like delegation means I give you permission. Alma Harris from Bath University has great research about this. And distributed is, I trust you. And that's what you want to move towards, that I don't need to micromanage you. Yes, you're going to make a mistake. We all do. I can make a list of all my mistakes. But even the organization, as I mentioned now, I work with the executive director. She's an amazing woman. Her name is Cam. And, she trusts me so much in terms of, do I make mistakes? Yes, but I'm always keeping her, let's say, I communicate what's going on. And she's like, I trust you. Just go for it. Do the facilitation. Let me know how it goes. And then she doesn't ask me to follow up, but I just know I want to get that conversation. She's almost like a mirror for me to reflect back and forth on to get that. And I think that's where we need to move towards, especially with middle leaders. If they feel like they're micromanaged and they're just being delegated, you need to tell your team this. Well, then you just tell them, because I really have no role.
Yes. I feel like you've touched upon something very important there. And I, speak to middle leaders who, like, and I guess there's middle at different levels, isn't there? There's middle,
Yes.
even head teachers can feel like a middle because there's still somebody that they're accountable to at times, and they really feel that they are being squished, having to do lots of things, but they're also super stretched because they're working, with these two different angles. So I was really interested in the idea of the human capital and those activities you talked about. Can you tell me a bit more about what that means and kind of what we can look for?
So there's a great book called Professional Capital by Michael Fullan and Dr. Hargraves, and he talks about the idea of human capital, social capital, and that leads to decision-making capital. And altogether, that's professional capital. So human capital is the first step, that with your team, how are you as a leader elevating, sharing, celebrating the expertise of each individual, not only for others to know, but for you to know when working with your team, so you understand where your strengths are and what are the areas and how you make your team. So that's your human capital. Now, once the team has an understanding of the human capital, you move to decision-making capital, where you get those collective efforts coming together. And those decisions are always focused on student learning. How does this impact student learning? So you have, I missed one. That's decision making. So you have human capital, then you have social capital. Sorry, I missed one. So everyone, you have to rewind. You have to rewind, everybody. This is a podcast. You have the social capital. That's when you get that collective understanding of each other. Then you move to decision making capital. And when you see it happen, it's beautiful. But the leader has to be intentional with the human, the individual expertise, moving to social, the collective group, and that then leads to really impactful decision-making capital. And it's knowing where, and everyone knows this when I facilitate, when you're looking at the human capital, it's when you start a meeting, and everyone talks about an icebreaker. I'm an anti-icebreaker. I don't want to talk about my dog when I was 3. You don't need to know my favorite ice cream, but it's almost looking at what is the objective of your meeting and how do you start off building a community at the start of the meeting, without having me just standing in front, but getting that connectivity. So for example, I'll start a meeting by saying, what made you smile today while in your classroom? So it already tries to get their mindset. Remember, it's 3:30 on a Wednesday. They're exhausted, but let's try to make them smile. What made you smile today during your classroom? Or if I'm working with middle leaders, again, after school, give me 5 words that your team would use to describe yourself as a leader. And they have to, trying to get them. And that also gives you insight as the leader of those 5 words. And you can see them changing and you can see the body language, because that is developing that human capital. I'm not really into an icebreaker and I'm nothing against it. Like some people do bingo, who's wearing, not into it. People find that disrespectful of their time. You want to make sure an inclusion activity is based upon a learning goal. Yeah. And that sets the tone. When I facilitate, and this is from Michael Wilkinson, he's a great facilitator. And he talks about, I kind of did my own version of it, but he started off the idea of the heart, the head, and the hands of facilitation. The heart to me is when you start with any meeting, you start building community, you start making everyone have a sense of belonging. That's the heart. It only takes 3 minutes. It doesn't take that long. If you turn to your partner and say, Emma, what made you smile today? And you can see people like, what made me smile? This child, I was given this great lesson. And that's the heart. And then when you go into the facilitation, you talk about the head. Those are those conceptual understandings, your objectives for that meeting. What are you trying to accomplish? So the teachers don't think, you could have done this in an email. So it should always be focused on student learning or impacting teacher practice. And the third is the hands. When they leave this meeting, what can they take away that will impact their practice? And if they can't think of anything, put it in an email.
That is a great tip. And so many people say that, don't they? You're sitting there thinking, this is just knowledge being imparted that, yeah, absolutely, this could have just been told, like, just tell me what to do, we'll go and do it. It's not a problem. And I guess that's where you're talking about the challenges for middle leaders are, how often are they able to then make decisions and have that collaborative
Yes.
process rather than just, do this for us, please, because that's different, is it? They're not
You're
necessarily middle
being a
leaders,
manager.
they're just,
They're passes of knowledge. I work with this beautiful, my dear friend. Her name is Helen Morgan, and she and I do the Middle Leader Certificate Program with Cindy and Jemana and Nunana. And Helen and I together, we always tell the middle leaders, some prerequisite when we work with senior leadership, ensure you have a clear job profile, so they understand their role. And you as a leader have to stick to it. If you say this is your responsibility, then you have to ensure it happens. The other thing we tell middle leaders is share your job profile with your team or make them aware of it. So if you go into their classroom and they're like, why are you in my classroom? Well, first of all, it should have been shared that you were doing that at the previous meeting, but it's also let them know at the start of the school year, these are my roles and responsibilities. This is a new role for me. I'm excited. I want to share with you what I look forward to working together on these aspects. And it's a celebration of your role. And then you look at their roles, but you need that data point to start off with the middle leaders so they have a clear understanding of what their responsibilities are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it's like in Luxembourg for middle leaders, but I would say there's a big proportion in the UK who would not feel like they have real clarity over what that job role is. And I sometimes think that's because maybe at senior leadership, people have applied for those roles. They're very kind of set. Job descriptions are vast usually. And in the UK, we have a little line at the end if you're on what we call the leadership scale, where it says, and anything else that is required to do in the job, and there are no set hours. You're just like, so this is all the stuff and anything else, basically.
And anything we can think of, we're going to add to it.
Yeah.
And by the way, you're a middle leader. You still have to teach.
Yeah, well, and that's part of that stretch, isn't it? But I think in the UK, the middle leaders are, maybe leading subjects. And a lot of schools, especially primary schools, there aren't necessarily job descriptions that go with that. It's just, can you help to take this on? And there's a real gap around what that looks like for middle leaders in terms of their own knowledge and understanding. But also, I think you've tapped in, what you're saying around senior leaders really knowing what they expect their middle leaders to be doing and how much time they're giving them to do it. I think I can see why they just feel so stretched sometimes because they're trying to squish it into tiny moments of time and they haven't got strategic thinking time.
Yes, and you hit on such a good point, Emma, that they really do need time away from the class. The challenge is with primary school teachers, when does that happen? Some schools say no lunch duties. They'll have somebody come in once within a cycle. With the high school, sometimes a little bit easier because they might have only like 3 or 4 classes, but regardless, they're still working with students and that's their sole responsibility. So they're on the fence. So they have to navigate working with parents, even if you had, let's say 4 classes, 20 in a class, you're still talking about 80 kids, 80 students, and you're still responsible for a team. You're still doing 80 report cards, 80 parent conferences, how many times a year? So that time allotment needs to be clarified. And senior leadership, and you said it beautifully, need to have an understanding of what the role is and how they envision these roles progressing forward. And time is one. And also the second is developing the capacity as middle leaders. You can't, I had a session, it was like 2 years ago, and I had 36 middle leaders. And the question was, how much training did you receive prior to starting your role? Most middle leaderships get hired now, March, April, May. Out of 36 middle leaders, I believe 21 or 22 received no training.
Yeah.
So suddenly you were let's say a 6th grade teacher. Now you're in charge of your 6th grade team, but you haven't had the capacity building of how do you navigate team meetings, difficult conversations, even how do you write an agenda? All of these, and that's what we're finding. The challenge is that middle leaders is, so as a senior leadership, think of those areas of capacity building, time, resources that you're using. Otherwise, you're putting that individual in a very difficult situation. And how can they be successful if they don't have an environment to support their learning as a leader?
Yeah. And I guess then sometimes there's that quite quick stepping stone into senior leadership with still know, we don't get this kind of training in certainly in the UK, in our teacher training, we're taught how to teach, not how to lead. So it's very, very different. And is that kind of where your passion is then, around middle leaders, and the role that you're doing now is supporting them?
Absolutely. I mean, I was just appointed the head of the Middle Leader Certificate Program. I love it, and we're trying. I think we do it well. So of course I'm not very objective, but it's more than just going to a school or doing a virtual session and saying, okay, you've done 8 hours of building and leading teams course, you're all set. What I love about this organization is we want to keep the conversation sustained over periods of time. So it's not just taking a course. So what we have, for example, we have the Middle Leader Certificate courses, which I facilitate, Helen does. Then we have the Middle Leader LinkedIn group. I don't know how many LinkedIn groups that are focused only for middle leaders, where we share, where we have different people connecting, asking for resources. Then we have a mentorship platform through ECIS, where you can connect and with a mentor from another international school. And then we have something called the Middle Leader Cafe, which are conversations. Yeah, I know.
I want to go to the cafe. That sounds great.
We have a cafe tonight, actually. I have one tonight at 5, which is free for middle leaders, and it's based upon topics that they want more information about. And that's a cafe. And then, of course, we have our bespoke training that we do at schools. And what I love that we do is that we don't just go in for a weekend. If you want me just for a weekend, we have to ensure that we continue these conversations virtually, follow up, because we know if you have one person in for a day, it will not make any impact. It won't. But we love those connections, and I think those collaborations and those relationships that we build for the middle leaders. I mean, this year alone, I worked with hundreds of middle leaders, and that's what I love. That's my passion and people write if they need help. I'm very privileged that way to have those connections.
I guess they're from all over the world.
They are. I mean, I've been very fortunate. I've worked with Saigon South International School for 2 years. I spent 10 days facilitating. This summer, I'm going to Canadian International School in Singapore. I work with, in April, I'll be in Zurich, and then I'll be in Munich. And yeah, I absolutely love it. And the schools are beautiful. I feel because you get to be welcomed by a school, which is gorgeous. But then I know people, and it's kind of like, I went to Zurich and I was nervous. No matter how many years you facilitate, I always get nervous. Like, oh my God, I'm totally organized. And as soon as I walked in, I heard Nancy, and it was a former colleague. And I'm like, oh, I feel so much better now. But I get that, when you're in international education community is quite small, even though it's global. It is quite small. So we're really so fortunate to meet people, and just the connections are beautiful. I love it.
Sounds so exciting, like jet setting off supporting.
No. And the funny part is everyone knows I don't really like to travel. Like, I love staying home, but I do love it because everyone knows before I used to be very anxious, but now I'm kind of like, okay, I'm traveling more than my husband now. I'm like, I love this.
It sounds so exciting. And I bet the impact is huge. And I guess when you were talking, it felt like you were very inspired by the people that you get to work with, and see what they do. Who are there kind of set people who've really inspired you? Or you've talked a bit about kind of books and like if you're reading, but
I would say in terms of, I'm very fortunate. The team that I work with now, I just adore. Like I've mentioned, Helen Morgan. I talk to her almost every day, and I'll be like, listen, I'm making this slide. Can you look at my presentation? So I love that type of collaboration in terms of a colleague who's just become a very dear friend to me. When I think of resources, there's certain podcasts, like you just started your podcast, so a round of applause for Emma. I always listen to John Michton and Dan Taylor's podcast, which is the International Schools Podcast. Brilliant. I love them. There's certain people I always follow on social media. There's an incredible, the head of school in Helsinki, Kathleen Nagli. She's inspirational. I think she's amazing. There's another podcast I listen to, Unhinged, collaboration with Trisha Friedman and Kathleen. Oh, I love them so much. And then there's the basic, when it comes to facilitation, I always go to Session Lab. Their resources are brilliant. And I love the International Association for Facilitators. That's a great resource as well.
Amazing.
So
It really
those are
gives
my
links. Yeah.
yes.
It's so great to hear all the different things. And that's what it's about, just sharing the knowledge. And I think tapping into what's going on across the world is really, really
It's
fascinating to me.
amazing. I love it. And I just feel like this community is just so giving and they're so generous that you can contact anyone. I remember a true story, Jim Knight. I don't know if you're familiar with Jim Knight. I love Jim Knight. He's been to Luxembourg several times. I'm a groupie. I'll do anything for him. One of the man of wisdom. So I collect all his books. So I was about to do a workshop and I took a picture and saying, I'm about to do a workshop. I have my Jim Knight library and I'm studying it. I'm ready. And Jim always writes back on social media and he writes back and he says, Nancy, you're missing 3 books. I'm like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that. I've fallen behind. And he goes, oh, I'll just send them to you. So as a gift, he sends me, so I have his complete collection of books. How is that incredible? What a beautiful person. I mean, his heart, like that's what I love about international education. Where do you get that? Where I take a picture of books, he noticed I'm missing 3 and he sends them to me as a gift. I love that.
What a great guy. He's like, you need to read some more, then you can really publicize it. Yeah, I mean, I have absolutely found that people, particularly on somewhere like LinkedIn, from a professional community sense, people are just so generous with their time. And
they are.
I mean, I'm fascinated in, that's why I'm doing this, fascinated in like meeting new people and finding out what they're doing, because everyone's willing to say, this is what we're doing and this is how it's working, and open their doors to you, which is just really, really, really special.
I agree. And this is what you've been doing. I mean, reaching out to all of us. I mean, this is amazing. I mean, I just met
nosy.
I just met you on LinkedIn. You're like, anybody want to talk? And I'm like, I'll talk. You were like, okay, let's get together. And how lucky are we? It worked so well.
And Nancy, it's been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. It's been really fascinating and some really great practical tips around kind of facilitation and thinking about middle leaders. And I think it's definitely something probably all senior leaders need to do more of. It's finding time, isn't it, to think about, right, what can we do better to support our middle leaders, because ultimately they are going to be the leaders of the future. And if we support them better, we're putting them in a really great position to then take over from us when we need to fly off and
absolutely. Emma, you said it perfectly. I totally thank you for this opportunity. I absolutely had a wonderful time talking to you.
You are so welcome. Thank you so much for listening to the Stories of School Leadership podcast. We'd love to know what inspired you in this episode, so do get in touch and tell us your thoughts. And please share this with friends and colleagues. If you have time, a review would mean so much. It really helps us to reach more people. If you'd like to connect with me to follow my journey or access some support, maybe supervision, coaching or early years consultancy, you can find me at Stories of School Leadership on Instagram. I'm Emma Lurie on LinkedIn, or my website is emmalurie.co.uk. I hope you have a great day, whatever you're getting up to next, and I can't wait to share the next episode with you.